Greetings, family. This is Dayvon Love, leaders of a beautiful struggle. This is the last day of the Maryland General Assembly. I'm going to give people a few more minutes to hop in. It's going to be a combination of a legislative update and also just some general commentary about the political landscape. So I'm going to update you all on some of the stuff we've been working on, some of the stuff that our partners are working on. So before I get into that, and as people are coming in to the live, I just want to make some really general commentary about just how important it is when we think about political engagement, civic engagement. You know, there's a tendency for, mainstream media and just people in general to focus almost exclusively on national politics. And while national politics is important, one of the places where so many decisions that impact our lives are made is on the state and local level. And, it's not really glorious. It's not something that gets a whole lot of kind of mainstream pop culture news attention, but it's extremely impactful for our community to be engaged on the local level. And so it's one of the reasons why LBS's commitment, our commitment to engaging the local legislative landscape, even though there's not a whole lot of fanfare about it, is because we're clear that that's where the impact is, right? And some of the things I'm going to talk about in a few minutes are things that are primarily worked out in the state legislature. And one quick reference that I actually make to help make the point. It's a gentleman that gave me a book years ago, and excuse the language, but it's just the name of the book. It's a book called rat fucking. And it is a term that was used by Republican political operatives after Barack Obama became president in 2008 and 2009. And when the Democrats had control of both houses, a lot of people probably don't remember there was a time where folks thought that the Republicans would never win a national election ever again. And one of the things that this book details, the book that I'm referencing, talks about how Republicans, and the reason why they use that term that I referenced earlier, is because they figure if they focus on taking state legislatures, it would help them, and focus on local races, it would help them build the base they need to eventually win on a national level. And they use that term because local offices are a lot cheaper to flip and cheaper to attain than, a congressional seat, right? Or a U.S. Senate seat or a governor's seat, right? So I'm giving that context to just provide more insight when we think about like those who are looking to seize power and just how important local legislatures are in seizing that power. So that just to give you some context as to our determination as an organization to focus so much on the state legislature, because state legislatures, again, have so much influence over our daily lives. All right, so that's a general context. So let me give a little bit of a update and then just some general commentary. For those who follow leaders of a beautiful struggle, revolutionary Pan-African nationalists, we believe the importance of black sovereignty and self-determination. We're clear we live in a society structured on racism and white supremacy, and that we're clear that we're engaged in political warfare to advance our collective condition as a people. I'm clear that this isn't a society where if we petition this larger society to recognize our humanity, that's going to be where our freedom comes from. It's going to be from our ability to organize ourselves as a people, as a power base, to make this society do the things that is necessary for our collective welfare as a community. I start with that general theory of change, like our general approach and worldview, because that colors the way that we come to the issue of talking about the Maryland General Assembly and some of these updates that I'm going to give. One of the issue areas that we've worked on kind of since we were founded is around issues of criminal and juvenile justice. And it was natural for us for that to be a place where we started a lot of our work, because many of us work with young people, and unfortunately too many young people and too many people in our community are impacted and are touched by the criminal justice system. One of the bills that we worked on this session was a bill that would have ended the practice of automatically charging youth as adults. Currently, Maryland is one of the few states where there are 33 charges. If a young person is charged with that crime, they are automatically charged as an adult. And young people in adult facilities are not entitled to mental health services. They're not entitled to education. Many of us wouldn't last 1 hour and maintain our sanity in an adult prison facility. And the way the process works is that if a young person's charged as an adult, they could be waved back down to the juvenile system where they have education and therapeutic services and other kinds of supports. And what ends up happening in the state of Maryland is that upwards of 80% of the young people that are charged as adults end up being waved back down into the juvenile justice system anyway. So if you think about, for instance, in fiscal year 2024, according to the Department of Juvenile Services, there were 529 young people who were charged as adults who were waved back down to the juvenile system. So that's just not that's not the overall number of you charged as adults. 529 young people in 1 year charged as adults who ended up being waved back down, which means they spent weeks, months, several months in an adult prison facility. And there's a way that kind of dehumanization, unfortunately, is tolerated by the state. Has been, my mentor, former Senator Jill Carter, who, when she was in the House of Delegates, was one of the first people I know of to put in a bill that would have reversed that. And in 2025, we worked on trying to end this practice. I think we had a lot of traction, and I think a lot of general support, but it was a bill that ultimately, neither chamber decided to advance. The House or the Senate decided to put that bill in the drawer and not advance it. And I start with that. So that actually didn't, that was a legislative effort that we weren't successful. That's something that will come back next year and try to, go back to the drawing board and end this dehumanizing practice. 80% of the young people in Maryland that are charged as adults are black kids. So we're talking something that explicitly is harmful to black children. So we can't help when I start with the worldview and perspective, because when we talk about racism and white supremacy, the only way that such a thing is tolerated is in a white supremacist society where youth are put in those conditions and folks are able to tolerate it and not move on it. And so I start with that because it is a general example of really the sad commentary of the Democratic Party. When you think about the importance of fighting back again, people, and I think rightly so, are horrified at the policy decisions and actions of the Trump administration. And I think, unfortunately, one of the things that Democrats have done is taken an approach of suing for peace as opposed to fighting for justice. And that suing for peace is something that the people who are going to be the most hardest hit. And when I say suing for peace, what I mean is I think there's a general strategy by the Democratic Party to appease the Trump administration, to appease the right wing, to try to pursue an electorate that voted for Donald Trump and the Republicans, as opposed to base building amongst black folks who don't vote, because Democrats generally don't deliver for our community. And so the auto charging piece that I just mentioned, the practice of automatically charging youth as adults, is one such example where in a state that has a Democratic Party trifecta, we're talking veto proof in the legislature in both chambers, and a Democratic governor. These are all things that should be easy if there's a true commitment to upending the system of white supremacy and advancing and protecting the humanity of people of African descent. Clearly, I think the bill that I just mentioned is an example of how things that really should be simple, should be a no-brainer, are things that have been difficult. Now, what I want to do is I want to give some credit where credit's due. I want to give some credit to the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland. We've worked with the Black Caucus for many years at this point. We've had our fights with the Black Caucus, but the Black Caucus has supported, many of our legislative efforts. The bill that I just mentioned was a Legislative Black Caucus priority, and we're grateful that the over 60-member Black Caucus, made it a point to prioritize that piece of legislation. So again, that's something that we'll come back to next year. But again, an example of, I think, the state of the political landscape. In addition to, in terms of giving credit to the Black Caucus for putting that piece of legislation, auto charging, ending the practice of auto charging, as their legislative priorities, there are two major legislative priorities that actually did make it, and that did pass, and those are the the Second Look Act. The Second Look Act is a bill that would, sponsored by Delegate Cheryl Pastor of Baltimore County and Senator Charles Sitnor of Baltimore County, a bill that would allow for people who've spent at least 20 years incarcerated an opportunity to petition the court to have their sentences modified. The rationale for that being that, again, I start with the worldview at the top because we're clear about the system of racism and white supremacy. You know, black men have 20% longer sentences than their white counterparts for identical crimes. Black people are 2.5 more times more likely to be incarcerated in the state of Maryland, where 72% of the incarcerated population, while only being 31% of the state's population. And so this bill is an attempt to make sure justice was done, right? To look at sentences and to have a mechanism to rebuff the racism that's embedded in the criminal justice system, as well as providing an opportunity for those who want to be rehabilitated and come back into society, who paid their debt to society, and who feel like they're able to contribute positively to allow an opportunity for that as well. Now, unfortunately, one of the things that was missing from that bill is it excluded those who were sentenced to life without parole. And it's important for people to know, think about life without parole, and the term that Republicans kept throwing around is, the worst of the worst, which demonstrates a lack of true understanding of how the criminal justice system works, because convictions are not necessarily reflective of what the person did. In many cases, it's reflective of how lawyered up you are, what the plea bargain is, what the policy and agenda is of the prosecutor. And again, because we know about the system of mass incarceration and the kind of tough on crime policies that in many ways were amplified by the 94 crime bill, we're clear, we should be clear that, when we look at a conviction, we should allow a judge to assess the veracity of that conviction, to assess the veracity of the sentence, given the overwhelming evidence of the embedded racism in the system. So those with life without parole have been excluded. That's something that we got to come back next year and try to have that included. But even with that being said, there are folks who will benefit from the opportunity to have their sentences looked at and assessed, to be able to have their sentences modified, and that's something that will help people. Again, we're glad the Black Caucus made it one of their priorities, and it's something that is a really important milestone for the state of Maryland. Additionally, one of their legislative priorities was a reparations bill, a bill that would establish a commission that would study slavery, Jim Crow, and other forms of racialized oppression in the state of Maryland, and this commission would then produce recommendations considering a wide range of forms of restitution and repair, and make those recommendations to the Maryland General Assembly in 2027. And so that bill, which for me, to be honest with you all, it's a study bill, right? So I actually felt that bill would be pretty easy to move because it's merely a study bill. Now, ultimately it passed. Again, shout out to the Black Caucus for the work that it put in to help to pass that piece of legislation as well. And so now it's going to be before the governor. And I'm sure people have seen some of the news reports that essentially say the governor has been evasive in terms of answering the question as to whether he's going to sign the bill or not. And I think, so what I want to say about that, I'm going to connect this to the last thing that I'm going to talk about, which is to say, we have to, as Black people, make a determination about the posture that we occupy. Trump, the conservative right wing, and just American civil society in general is at war with Black people and our humanity. No matter how nice people are interpersonally, we should be clear that as Black people, we need to organize ourselves from the vantage point that we're at war, that this is a contestation for power and resources, We're not going. We should not expect, if we're serious, to be dependent on the benevolence of people outside of our community, and we shouldn't try to seek middle ground with folks for whom their agenda is fundamentally about power and control. Right? Continued domination of people of African descent, people of color, poor and oppressed people around the world. We need to be clear what our posture is. And so I say that in the context of the conversation as to whether or not the governor's going to sign the bill, because in my estimation, that decision will determine for me what his posture is as it relates to what I just mentioned, which is there clarity about the importance of understanding that as Black people, we are at war. There's a system that is at war with us, and we have to be in a posture of political warfare to protect and advance our interests. And that a study bill provides us minimal but important ammunition as to how we are to comport ourselves as people in this political landscape. And so we're going to ask people, reach out to the governor's people, reach out to the governor himself and urge him to sign the bill. And I think that, again, it's such a small step, but it's such an important step in terms of thinking about what's possible in the political landscape for Black people as it relates to reparations. Last thing that I want to raise is, one of our partners in advocacy here in the state's capital in Maryland, in Annapolis, CASA, has been working on legislation in many ways in response to the federal administration's political hostility towards immigrants, particularly immigrants of color. And I want to be real clear about that, because there's a way that when people say immigrants, there's certain faces and people they have in mind, right? And often that excludes the fact, for instance, that there are many immigrants of African descent who, in many ways, their exposure to deportation, which really should be understood as an extension of the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration, that immigrants of African descent are at higher levels of exposure to the violence of the immigration system than others. And then when you think about the rhetoric, the discourses that the right wing uses to characterize immigrants, is the same rhetoric that they use in the process of mass incarceration policies against Black people here in the United States. The same criminalization, characterizing, using individual isolated instances of brutality, right? And then they use those individual instances to paint immigrants of color, not the white ones. So it's important to be clear about that too, because there are lots of white immigrants as well, but that's not who they're talking about, right? They know they're talking about immigrants of color, Black and brown. And so there's a way that those notions are weaponized in ways that, as Black people, we should be clear. Black people in the United States, we should be clear that is what those weapons mean, what that rhetoric does. And so CASA has been in Maryland putting in legislation in the legislature to try to provide some protections for immigrants against ICE, right, and against the Trump agenda. And one of the things that is, in some ways, the most tragic about the situation that we're in is that in a state with a Democratic Party trifecta, it should be real easy to say, I shouldn't be allowed to go into the courthouses or schools or places where, folks, it would impair people's ability to live life if they're afraid of ICE being there, right? It should be easy to say that the 287G program, which would essentially allow ICE to deputize law enforcement to be ICE agents, that to me should be easy for Democrats. Right? Because regardless of where a person lives, right, people should not live in fear of a political agenda that wants to use deportation as a political bludgeon to get credit, to get political points from folks that have a general antipathy for people of color. Like that, I mean, to me, in some ways, the politics of that should be easy. And, you know, we're in the last day of the Maryland General Assembly. And unfortunately, this bill that includes both sensitive locations and the 287G program that I just mentioned are fighting for their life to try to get passed on the last day of the Maryland General Assembly. And again, it's another example of just how weak the Democrats are. It gives an example of just the level of political indifference and calculation. I mean, in some ways, it's astounding that this is the thing, that on the last day of session, folks are fighting for their life to try to move this legislation that has our people. So when I say our people, I'm talking about, you know, again, there are folks in the African diaspora that are immigrants that are impacted by this, our brown sisters and brothers that are impacted by this, you know. So this is something that when we think about what is it that we demand of the Democratic Party, and some people will often get upset at me for my consistent criticism of the Democratic Party, but it's just hard to overstate how disappointed it is that in a Democratic Party trifecta that this is a fight. Like, we're not talking about abolishing ICE. You know what I'm saying? Like, we're not talking about, like, you know, wide-ranging amnesty, which are policies that I would support, but we're not even talking about that, right? We're talking about, like, very incremental, defensive pieces of legislation that should be simple and easy. So I wanted to do this video, one, again, to just give people an update on just some of the stuff that we're working on and some of the stuff that we're doing to raise awareness about the fact that this is the state of the legislature. But I want to end on this. Well, actually, before I do that, so let me just say, go to CASA's page, CASA for All. Go to CASA's page. You'll see it on LBS's stuff as well. If you go to our stories, you'll see a graphic. The bill that has the sensitive locations and the 287G measure have left the House, and they got to be put up for a vote in the Senate. And so it's up to Senator Bill Ferguson, who's the Senate president, to do the work to move it along. So check out CASA for All. And you can also check out LBS's stuff, where you can find information for CASA. Send an email, call, urge them to move CASA's effort. All the information about the specifics of the bill and whatnot are on the information on CASA's page that, again, you can see on our stuff. Make those calls, send those emails. Let's try to push them and see if we can make something happen. It's looking bleak, but let's see if community pressure can make that happen. And then let me end this video on this, which is, as I started, you know, people who know me and know LBS, we're clear. We're about black liberation. We're clear that what is important for our community is the political and civic machinery to be able to advance and protect our interests. We're clear that we're in a society that does not have much regard for our humanity. There are no white saviors. We're not looking for nobody to save us. What we're looking for is the ability to have what we need to do for ourselves. And when we think about our relationship to the Democratic Party, it's generally been one of exploitation. We're a captured electorate. Being a person who lives in Baltimore and in Maryland, we're a captured electorate as it relates to what our vote means. But we have to still engage the system. We have to engage it on terms where we're not accepting the kind of exploited relationship, but we have to engage the system, engage the Democratic Party from a position of power and strength, which includes engaging other third or alternative party formations, which is something you'll hear more about from LBS in the coming months. But what I want to say is that in a state that should have the greatest potential to pursue policies for black liberation, we're struggling to get to the basics. And so it's going to be really important that people are engaged and mobilized, so that we can make this place live up to what they say it is. And so, once again, this is Dayvon, leaders of a beautiful struggle. Thank you all for taking your time to come in and watch this video. For those who see it later, appreciate you taking the time. If you see this later, you can still make those calls. Continue to look out for LBS in our work, our action alerts, the stuff that we're working on, and our partners. And I'll be here in Annapolis for another couple of hours. If anything comes up, we'll post it. But let's help our friends at Caucus try to move this legislation to help protect our sisters and brothers from the immigration system and its violence. So let's join in to help our friends. All right, y'all, take care. Peace.